Mechthild. I'm a professor in midwifery at Hanover Medical School in Germany. And I added to the already given title the slight undertitle, The Approach of a Midwife. So I'm not a gene specialist, as you can easily imagine. And it took me quite a while how to approach this complex topic best, knowing that I'm amongst such important and well-known experts. So, and I thought, what will and what could be the root of the midwife? So the fetal origin hypothesis, as Jonathan already explained in the morning, proposes that cardiovascular diseases originates through the response of a fetus or infant to undernutrition that permanently changes the structure and the function of the body. And here on the right-hand side, you see David Barker sitting in the middle of many, many boxes, which probably contains a lot of records. Where did this all start? And there were some questions about it this morning. So I was very pleased when I heard these questions. It all started in the early 20th century in Hertfordshire, which is in the middle of England. And this area, they really had some, let's say, not so well health reports. In 1903, they said they are malnourished, poorly housed, and deprived children. And for English and Wales, the birth rate was at that time, has for 33 years been steadily declining. And the health authorities concluded it is of national importance that the life of every infant needs to be vigorously conserved. This has to do with the fetal programming hypothesis. And of course, behind every strong man, there is an even stronger woman, and this is a midwife, and she was called Ethel Margaret Burnside. And at that time, she was the chief house visitor and lady inspector of midwives. And in 1911, in the paper it says, she set up an army of midwives to attend women in childbirth and to advise mothers on how to keep their infants healthy after birth. And she was described as a big, bony woman, about 5 feet and 10 inches tall, with a long, thick face and dark hair, which she was scraped back, a very imposing presence, a penetrating voice, and a dominant personality. Wow, wow, wow. Let's hear. So what she did, she asked the overall chief inspector for 60 spring balances. So this is a spring balance on the right-hand side. It's, well, not from the early 20th century, but it's more a modern version. And she did many kilometers on her bicycle every year. So in 1 year, she wrote that she was being on her bike about nearly 3,000 miles this year. Then what she also did, she started to record activities. She recorded illnesses and all the developments of the baby on a card. The card was then handed into the county office, where the information was transcribed into ledgers. And this is one paper of this particular ledger. And we can here, can you see my file on the screen when I'm moving this here?
Yes, yes.
Super. So we have here one baby. And we have the weight of birth, the weight after 1 year, the food, no visits, the number of visits. So we have one baby here, which already gained some weight. And my students and we concluded last week, because they did my rehearsal to the students, of course, and they said, well, B must stand for breastfeeding, and this mother attended 11 visits. The baby healthy and well developed, and it went then to Brooklyn School. The next one, also breastfed, 12 visits, but there is something, well, moved to a different location. And here we have a comment. It says, had measles. Okay, having measles, you know, in the first years is quite something. So in the third line, we have, also good increase in birth weight. And then we have what? This probably stands for bottle fat, huh? 11 visits. And then, you know, what's this here? Abscess in neck opened, in glandular neck opened, and anterior fontanelle still open at 3 years. So this must have been added quite later. So this baby probably had a problem also. It increased in weight. And the next one increased in weight, and look, BB could be breast and bottle fed. So what we were thinking, 9 visits, healthy and normal, and went to booklet school. Wow. And these particular records were the big precious gift David Barker was able to get access to. And this is so interesting to read, Emma. So Emma, I know you are an anthropologist, and you should read this particular paper of David Barker, the midwives, the coincidence and the hypothesis. It's for you as an anthropologist. You will smell the odor of this particular time when all this started. What they discovered at that time, smaller people at birth or during infancy are more likely to have higher blood pressures, more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, more likely to develop different patterns of blood lipids, reduced bone density, altered stress responses, thicker left ventricular walls, less elastic arteries, different hormonal profiles, and that they are aging more rapidly. Here we are with the headline or with the homepage picture of our cost action perinatal mental health and birth. And it's now our task to link what we have just heard to what we are so much busy with in this particular cost action. It's called, or it is labeled as obstetric violence. And this is a term which is known since 2007. It is a law term in Venezuela, and it stands for an increasing evidence of disrespect, mistreatment, and abuse of persons during childbirth, together with inappropriate application of interventions and adverse communication patterns. And these behaviors are subsumed under the terms obstetric violence and disrespect and abuse in childbirth. There is one lady, she's called Boren, and she reviewed 65 studies in a systematic way. And she set up a typology of terms women may suffer from, and that they then may be able to say that I was not treated well and appropriately. So it is physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, stigma and discrimination, failure to meet professional standards of care, poor rapport between women and providers, healthcare system conditions and constraints. So if only one of these particular categories or features fits, then the term obstetric violence is appropriate. So imagine there is a woman and she met a care provider like a midwife or somebody else, and this person told her something, it was inappropriate, like verbal abuse, then this is something she may suffer from on a longer period and distance. This movement has gained some quite attention, not only in low-income countries, but also in high-income countries. And in 2019, Saraswati Vedam, midwife from Vancouver, took as a grounded US survey on giving voice to mothers and did some follow-up studies with this particular report. There has been a longer interest in reports which actually labeled it to listen to mothers, and they come from the 2010s years. So one is called Listening to Mothers in Pregnancy and Birth, and the other one is called Listening to Mothers, New Mothers Speak Out, from April 2013. So let's now return to the 2019 report, and I have selected here one result which actually labels here the place of birth, like hospital, birth center, outside hospital, home, transferred to hospital from community. And here you find some mistreatment items, like your private or personal information was shared without your consent, several ones. And interestingly, if women needed to be transferred from the community to the hospital, they were quite likely, 26%, 34%, that they experienced some features of obstetric violence, like healthcare providers shouted or scolded at a woman, or here the overall summary category, any mistreatment happened. So very interesting numbers. And what did Saraswati's group then do with all this data? They set up 4 scales, and they call them autonomy, respect, discrimination, and mistreatment scales. And they tried to assess what women really perceived. So the issue is that if you want to survey something which is a soft marker, like women's perception, it always becomes challenging, because the issue is that 3 or 4 women should really be able to make a reliable and valid response into the survey. They created 4 tools, and this for psychometrically validated scores: the Mothers on Respect Index, the Mother's Autonomy in Decision-Making tool, and the Mistreatment Index. And we here in Hanover were able to develop the Discrimination and Mistreatment tool, which is a tool validated in German and which has been done by Claudia Limmer. And it has become quite a habit in our country that on the 25th of November in every year, women are invited to put down a rose in front of a maternal health facility, and just to demonstrate and to let the people know that they have experienced obstetric violence in this particular facility. So this is more or less the background of the current ongoing cost action, and probably some of you are familiar with it. We now need to bring together the fetal origin hypothesis thoughts and developments, and what we have just heard about inappropriate interventions and behaviors during intrapartum care. And one paper we could start with is a paper from 2013, which actually stresses the importance the phenomenon that cesarean section and the development of the immune system in the offspring are closely related. And we have many, many studies which actually now focusing on the microbiome. We have heard about stress this morning, and we have here a big domain on epigenetics as well. So let's have a quick look in all these 3 areas. What we did not discuss yet today is the so-called hygiene hypothesis. So every newborn should have a reasonable bacterial diversity, which may and should contribute to the development of the immune system. And following this thought, there is the assumption that the gut microbiome colonization, secondary to intrapartum events and mode of birth, and neonatal pharmacological interventions and environmental factors may be impacted by this, and that this is then in addition altering the immune response again. So this is what we understand as the extended hygiene hypothesis. And this then has a lot of associations and create a lot of evidence for long-term non-communicable diseases. Now, well, if I'm going to talk about stress, so I send my big apologies to Jonathan now, but it's nobody can do this better than you, but I actually enjoyed looking into some of the literature, and I found this overview, which clearly shows what you have been showing this morning, that we have here the whole stress and system and the disorders which may then actually develop if there is too much stress in the system. So we have developmental history, genetic variation, stress, nutrition, aging, all this may contribute to stress. And we have here the cortico-releasing hormone, the AVP in the ZNS, then the HPA axis, and going down via hypothalamus, and then adrenaline gland, cortisol, and then there is this huge push into the target issues, which may then, as a consequence, increase metabolic syndrome diseases like insulin resistance, visceral obesity, sarcopenia, and also polycystic ovarian syndrome, endothelial dysfunctional diseases or inflammation, arteriosclerosis, osteopenia or osteoporosis, sleep apnea, a lot of endocrine consequences. And what we also already see here, and what I will focus in a minute, is that there is something else which is actually at the same level than the HPA axis, and it refers to the systemic suprathetic adrenomedullary system. So I will come back to this in a minute, and you can already look at the so-called locus coeruleus and norepinephrine system. First, I would like to show you the consequences of hyperactivation or hypoactivation of the HPH axis in terms of various diseases. So if we have an increased HPA axis activity, people may suffer, or even women may suffer from severe chronic disease like melancholic depression, anorexia nervosa, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, chronic excessive exercise, malnutrition, diabetes mellitus, hyperthyroidism, central obesity, childhood sexual abuse, and pregnancy, because pregnancy is really elevating and really increasing so many endocrinological pathways, and this ranks here. Decreased HPH axis activities may be followed by atypical depression, seasonal depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, hypothyroidism, adrenal suppression, post-glucocorticoid therapy, post-stress, nicotine withdrawal, postpartum, menopause, and rheumatoid arthritis. And there is also a group which is called the disrupted HPA axis activities, like Cushing syndrome, glucocorticoid deficiency, and glucocorticoid resistance. And it was a pleasure to find this book chapter here from all these HPH experts, because it is a follow-up of everything else which already is known, and it is from 2020. And to my surprise, the circadian clock activities around the suprachiasmatic nucleus and all these diurnal, daily patterns we have, like cortisol and so on, they of course are clearly linked to HPH activity. And this is something which needs to be incorporated, but this is of course was not known in 2009 in the earlier picture we saw here, and it was definitely not yet known in this paper from 2002. And I remember Krusov's presenting this hypothalamic pituitary adrenaline axis when he attended the Brighton conference at fetal programming. I think it was the inauguration of the Doha Society in this year, in 2003 in Brighton. And in this lecture, he really pointed out that we have on the one side the HPA axis, coming here with the hippocampus, CRH, it goes then to the ACTH via the blood, and then to the adrenal gland, and then there's the cortisol. And here we have, as a parallel system, the so-called locus coeruleus norepinephrine system. And this is a system which has a very natural and very physiological function during a normal physiological birth. So this is the system I would call the physiological stress system we need to have when a woman is giving birth. When the woman is not giving birth, so it has the capability to decrease the neurovegetative functions like eating and sleeping. It activates the amygdala, which fear-related behaviors. And it is also related to the long-term storage of aversively charged emotional memories, more or less located in the hippocampus and in the striatum. And I would like to point your attention already to this particular POMP gene, which I will come back to later. But for the moment, well, we still need to go into the epigenetics domain. And as with every serious lecture, you need to define your field of study. I mean, apologies again to Jonathan. So this is my way of defining DNA methylation. It's the epigenetic regulates the expression of certain genes and the silencing of others, and that epigenetics mechanisms are important in cell and organism plasticity, especially during gestation and childhood. And that the DNA methylation can then tag and activate or inactivate genes, and it is the binding of a methyl group to a cytosine-rich site, which is followed by a guanine site G, and these two are connected by a phosphate bond P, and they are commonly referred to as the GPC site, or in more specific terms, the cytosine nucleotide phosphate guanine nucleotide. But you probably understood it better from how Jonathan explained it this morning. So midwives went into this, and they became very affected by these thoughts and ideas. And we have some here, the EPIC hypothesis, epigenetic impact of childbirth hypothesis, assuming and claiming that the use of interventions during labor, like using or applying synthetic oxytocin, antibiotics, shortening labor duration, or cesarean delivery, that all these mechanisms or interventions can influence epigenetic remodeling and microbiome environment, and that this is subsequently related to the health of mothers and children. And furthermore, our colleagues, they wrote a paper on this familiar topic, whether the mode of birth impacts on the future health of neonates, assuming that when there is a spontaneous birth, that the mother has a normal exposure to the maternal microbiota and hormonal surges, and a so-called physiological stressful birth, followed by a normal gut colonization and the development of the immune system and the stress response system in an appropriate way, and that this is then followed by a decreased risk of childhood and adult disease. Whereas when a baby is going to be delivered by a cesarean section, there's usually no exposure to the maternal microbiota, less stressful delivery, absence of hormonal surges, and this is then followed by a gut dysbiosis, impaired development of the immune systems and stress response, and an increased risk of childhood and adult disease. So how is this all then related to labor? So methylation related to programming the immune system appears to be specifically susceptible to alterations in early life, and exposures occurring during the labor and birth process should be carefully considered. And labor duration has usually an important or a special meaning to us as midwives. And we know from a study from Scandinavia that the labor duration of premipar was found to be longer in settings with low prevalence of interventions compared to the duration commonly described. And you can easily imagine, so as less as you do, as longer the labor might be. Assuming that sometimes, but not always, of course, even cesarean section can be an intervention just to cut down the normal length of labor. And there has been a study from Almgren and Schlinzig a couple of years ago, and they studied in hematopoietic stem cells that the DNA from CD34 positive cells from babies born by cesarean sections were more methylated than the DNA from CD34 positive cells from babies born vaginally. Interesting, and I love this. And that the CpG-specific strong relationship between the duration of labor and the locus-specific DNA methylation seems to be evident. And what they concluded with is that the methylation status at onset of vaginal birth resembles that of babies born by cesarean section. So the question is whether DNA methylation differences progressively change during the process of labor. We have here the first hints for this. I know of no study which picked up this particular topic since then, but we also start to think of whether changes of the DNA methylations may be triggered by intrapartum interventions like augmented oxytocin augmentation or other interventions during the course of labor. But I could not find any further studies on these issues. And so I'm now moving to the more known studies on DNA methylation status of C-sections and spontaneous birth. There is one recent study. It came out and was published in 2021, published by a Chinese group, Jun Sang, and they investigated the association between cesarean section-born babies and DNA methylation status in the cord blood of 70 elective cesarean section-born babies and 70 spontaneously born babies. A total of nearly 500 GPC sites from 40 genes were included in the analysis, and a total of 165 differentially methylated positions exhibited differences in DNA methylation by 10% or more between the elective cesarean section group and the spontaneous birth group, most often related to the development of the immune system. So the conclusion is here that these differentially methylated positions identified between the elective cesarean section group and the spontaneous birth group might be largely explained by the cell type. The next study refers to a study which I know that Kerstin knows it very well because we have studied it together, and it's about the altered DNA methylation in white blood cells after cesarean section. So blood samples were taken from 37 newborn infants, 21 born by spontaneous birth, 16 by cesarean section, and samples were taken from the umbilical cord and at 3 and up to 5 days after birth. Leukocytes from infants born by C-section exhibited a significantly higher DNA methylation than leukocytes of those born spontaneously directly at birth. In the spontaneous birth group, newborns had stable levels of DNA methylation when comparing cord blood values within 3 to 5 days after birth. And in the C-section group, on postnatal days 3 to 5, the DNA methylation had decreased in the C-section group and was no longer significantly different from the values in the spontaneous birth group. The next study is very easy to understand because the result is already in the title. It says the delivery type is not associated with global methylation at birth. So to compare, the authors compared global DNA methylation in infants born by cesarean delivery with the DNA methylation level of infants born by vaginal birth. And they did it in a large birth cohort study, and the level of methylation was measured in white blood cells from cord blood using 2 separate DNA methylation techniques. And at birth, there was no difference in global DNA methylation between babies born by C-section versus those being born by spontaneously. And in addition, there was no difference between planned versus emergency cesarean section babies. So the last study in this row is in this series is the ones from the Vienna group, and they investigated umbilical cord blood cells after birth for global methylation in 41 newborn babies. 23 had a spontaneous birth and 18 an elective C-section, and the methylation of 96 single genes was measured. There was no difference in global methylation, and the level of methylation of change linked to T cell activation, cytokine production, inflammatory response, and stem cell transcription was significantly lower in newborns after spontaneous birth. And this suggests, this is what we have learned this morning from Jonathan, this suggests that these genes would be more active because the methylation was lower and that they were more active in the spontaneously born infants in comparison to the infants born by C-section. So please allow me a very, very cautious inference conclusion. Increased DNA methylation is visible with babies born by cesarean section. There seem to be transitory changes of leukocytes in the cesarean section group, and the methylation is lower in genes involved in the immune system and is more active in the group of babies born spontaneously rather than compared to those born or delivered by cesarean section. And various cell types are involved in the development of the immune system. So again, there is this link, and this made me so much thinking. After all, I didn't know what to conclude, where to go on with this presentation here. There are clearly links to the immune system, what we have heard before, and which are not leading so much and keeping us in the epigenetic environment at the moment. So I, as a midwife, started to think, and you see and get here some pictures. This is actually in my office. I'm sitting here right now. So there's the ward of the postpartum ward. There's the door of one of the mothers. This is one mother visiting me. This is in our labor ward. So there are lots of chats, and I want to report from my last Tuesday chat. So on Tuesdays, I'm still attending and going to labor ward. I'm changing my dress, and if people see me and they see me in blue, then they say, oh, it's Tuesday today because I'm in blue instead of white. And I needed to talk to a specific colleague. It was exactly last Tuesday. And we needed to talk because a woman has, well, she said that she felt that she was not treated well by myself and my, well, not by me, but by either one of us. So my colleague and me, she perceived the two of us totally different. So I was the lucky one, but not she. Oh. And but my colleague is a very experienced midwife, and I thought, oh my goodness, what shall we do with this woman and this stories? And we really started to have a very serious chat, and we finally then concluded on the following: why do women differ in their experience? Because what we do not understand as midwives is, imagine there are two women with a completely similar story or history, with very similar features of the birth process, with very similar features of the unborn and newborn, let's say the same weight, the same gestational week, etc. But they may have a very different birth experience, and sometimes one experienced the care as traumatic and the same woman with the same features not. And this then guided my thinking, how we could now move on. And so the title of the next couple of slides is that I'm going to talk a little bit about transgenerational programming. And Jonathan might now laugh to see here Sir Peter Gluckman, but in my opinion, he was the first one right from the beginning in the early 2000s who really dared to talk about psychiatric side effects in terms of fetal programming. So they were all talking about cardiovascular disease and all those well-known metabolic effects, which in the early 2000s. And Peter Gluckman, at that time, he talked about schizophrenia and all other psychiatric effects. And this has now become pretty much into attention. And there, I think, there might be a good relationship to our topic, our underlying topic of obstetric violence. So I would like to introduce you now to a paper which really focuses on the transgenerational impact of so-called intimate partner violence on methylation in the promoter of the glucocorticoid receptor. This paper is from 2011, and I became known to it quite after it became published. It's from a group at the Lake Constance in the very south of Germany. And they analyzed the methylation status of the glucocorticoid receptor gene in mothers and their children, and the children were between 10 and 19 years after birth. Data were combined with a retrospective evaluation of the maternal exposure to intimate partner violence, and the data analysis focused on the DNA methylation at the glucocorticoid receptor gene NR3C1. We have seen this, you talked about it this morning, Jonathan. And here you can see now a description of the data set and about the mothers and the children. So we have 29 participants. We have here on this side mothers and the maternal exposure to intimate partner violence before pregnancy, during pregnancy, or after pregnancy. In total, there were 13, and 8 of the mothers had received intimate partner violence during pregnancy. And the children's gender were male and female, so we have the numbers of 25. And we also have the children's age, and as I said before, they range from 10 to 19 years. Mode of birth from the children, maternal age at birth, and the maternal country of origin. So we have Russia, Poland, Turkey, Germany, Iraq, Russia, maybe Taiwan, Iran, so many other countries. And I want to draw your attention now to the effects of the intimate partner violence during pregnancy. And there was a particular result. They found that the gestational effects of the intimate partner violence on methylation of the glucocorticoid receptor gene was found in the children for those who had experienced intimate partner violence during pregnancy. And then when I moved further on with preparing this lecture, I came across a meta-analysis, which was exactly studying this particular subject, maternal psychosocial stress during pregnancy, and how this alters the epigenetic signature of the glucocorticoid receptor gene promoter in their offspring. And you see here now about, I think, 7 studies. So one of this is the Rutger one, the one we just heard about it. And another very well-known study is the one from Oberlander. And they use the same technique you are using, you know, the pure sequencing. We heard about this morning, Jonathan. And the Rutger group, they did something different. And now they did a quantitative meta-analysis and came up with a particular plot, how it is very familiar in meta-analysis. And this has the advantage that studies which previous results, which may not have been significant, turn out to become significant now with the increased numbers of participants. So from all those studies participating and put into this meta-analysis, we have now 977 participants. We see here the Rutger study, and there has been found a significant effect of the maternal impact of intimate partner violence on the glucocorticoid receptor gene in the offspring, in particular on the GPC site 36, but not on other GPC sites, but this particular one was significant. And I thought, this is really great stuff. I mean, you know, all the studies do study the same subject, and then they come to a conclusion which really helps us to come to an significant effect. And this is, as clinicians, we are always very happy if we have interventions which such clear results, and that we then can say, well, we can recommend treatment A, B, C, or D to women and their babies. But there's always so many buts in basic science. And I have learned from further reading that, and this is what I want to share with you already now, that intimate partner violence is a far too complex topic and complex violence, that this cannot be explained by only one significant change in one particular GPC site 36. So this is far too little. I mean, our system, the system in which we live, is even bigger. It's even more complex than that. But this particular GPC site plays a role in the IPF, in the intimate partner violence explanations. So the next study I would like to make you familiar with is a study on grandmaternal stress and DNA methylation of the grandchild. So if you look at this woman here, she's the grandmother, she's expecting her child, and in this child, in the womb, there are already the germ cells of the third generation. And this group investigated whether psychosocial stress during pregnancy affects DNA methylation of the grandchildren. And they examined the multi-generational hypothesis that grandmaternal exposure to psychosocial stress during pregnancy affects DNA methylation of the grandchild. So here you see the grandmothers, and they were able to look at their psychosocial traits, and they knew that they had prenatal stress either in form of intimate partner violence or community or domestic violence. And on the other side, there are the grandchildren with biological traits and saliva samples taken, and from those the DNA methylation got analyzed, and they called it an epigenome-wide association study, EWAS. So the results report that the genome-wide DNA methylation profile in 121 children, 65 were females and 56 males, and they tested the associations with exposure to grandmaternal interpersonal violence during pregnancy, and they observed methylation variations of 5 CPG sites significantly associated with the grandmother's report of exposure to violence while pregnant with the mother of the children. Whoa, so grandmaternal stress, and I think this must be something Peter Gluckman must have been thinking of without knowing and thinking of any evidence in the early 2000s. The next study I would like to talk to you is about the study which analyzes and uses and works with the POMP gene. So here we now see children, and it was investigated whether their phenotype, so their behavior, and an altered pro-opiomelanocortin gene, so this particular POMP gene, which is based and located in the limbic system, whether there is an altered expression in Tanzanian children after abuse. And the group around Thomas Albert is the senior, but he's, all those who worked with him, they did quite a couple of studies in low-income countries where the cultural circumstances are far more rude, and so that it is far more likely that children experience abuse. They did structured interviews with 409 children, and then they set up 2 groups. There was one group with children with high exposure of abuse, and they found 6 or more forms of abuse. And there was another group with low exposure of abuse, with 4 or less forms of abuse, and they had these were 25 children. And the children, it was a self-report study, so they answered in surveys about their maltreatment. And in the high exposure group, they found much more mental health problems compared to the low exposure group. And saliva and blood sampling was taken from both. And they analyzed DNA methylation for CpG sites in the POMP gene, in the glucocorticoid receptor gene, and in other genes, the AVP genes, and so in several other stress-related genes. And there was one very interesting result, which I wanted to share with you, is that they found epigenetic modifications in the POMP gene in both groups. So, and the one group, they were suffering of mental health impairment, but the other group, which actually has the same modifications in the POMP gene, they were not suffering of this mental health impairment. And whoa, I find this so particularly interesting, because this might explain a little bit why some women are not, you know, I'm always thinking of childbearing women, and why some of them might be aware of something and others not. But let's follow the root of and the argument and discourse of some studies. So this group around those in Constance, they then said that the situation is so complex and situations cannot be explained by only changes in one gene. And they are now stating there should be something methodological investigations, and they called it the stress-induced methylome switch. And that if there is such a methylome switch, this would then be able to terminate hormonal stress responses in prenatally stressed children. And this is another study we now want to look at, because there is actually obviously the opportunity that if there is a certain mechanism going on, that something which occurs and started with prenatal stress may epigenetically shape resilience, which actually might now contribute to a little bit of a confusion, but it's very interesting. So they studied mental health and epigenome-wide DNA methylation following intimate partner violence, and mothers exposed to pregnancy intimate partner violence, they were living in a Brazilian city, and they collected saliva samples. And these mothers expressed elevated depression, post-traumatic stress disorders, and anxiety symptoms. And then there were children with similar psychiatric problems when they experienced maternal intimate partner violence after being born. But there were children without problems when maternal intimate partner violence occurred, both prenatal and after pregnancy. And this is here the interesting term. These children were without problems, although they had experienced their mothers had experienced intimate partner violence. But it was not only in pregnancy, it was also after pregnancy. So the authors conclude now that following prenatal intimate partner violence, genomic sites in genes encoding the glucocorticoid receptor, and its repressor, so it's not the promoter, it's the opposite, it's the repressor, were among the most differentiality methylated and indicated an enhanced ability. And this was then able to terminate the hormonal stress responses in prenatally stressed children. Well, this leaves us now with, let's say, a couple of pretty good questions. But if you allow me, I can still continue a little bit and try now a little bit of want to phrase 3 different routes to consider how to understand these varying results. So our last study was a little bit of a paradoxical thing, so that something which children experience had then a resilient effect because they experienced it again postnatally. And this paradoxical thing reminded me of something which we know, so those who are epidemiologically interested and who work in obstetrics, and it's called the Latino paradox. The Latino paradox is an epidemiological finding that Latino Americans tend to have health outcomes that paradoxically are comparable to, or in some cases better than those of their US non-Hispanic white counterparts, even though Hispanics have lower average income and education. And this Latino paradox has been studied and investigated here 15 years ago, and it was quite common that there were studies finding some interesting results that the obstetrical outcomes of migrants moving to another country were as good as those in high-income countries, even if they were coming from a low-income country in the first generation. So not so much to worry about those migrants in the first generation. And I'm showing you now 2 references, and the first reference confirms this, that resilience during pregnancy by race, ethnicity, and nativity, evidence of a Hispanic immigrant advantage. So this is a recent study, and they are still coming to this conclusion. So this is that there is still this evidence, whereas my dear colleagues from Berlin, Matthias David, they also investigated the Latino paradox, and they could not confirm it. So there are, of course, there are then some confounders, and I wanted to mention this to you because this might actually have as an explanation mechanism. There might also be something which happened to mother as terms of violating situation, which could then be compensated by other mechanisms as described earlier in this presentation. Another route to think of now is that what we have learned is that there is so much known about the glucocorticoid receptor epigenetic regulation mechanism, and we all know the very protective environmental exposures in terms of breastfeeding, maternal sensitive caregiving, gentle touch. And then we see here some limitations. And for me, it sounds like that there is no rationale for CpG sites selectivity. I'm not sure what this means to an expert, but for me, it means that the issues or the phenomena are much more complex and that they can be explained by GPC sites significances and findings only, so that there is quite a more complex understanding needs to be done to understand the neuroendocrine regulation, socio-emotional development, and the neurobehavioral profile of the offspring of children whose mothers have experienced serious trauma. And the third route to go now is, and this is what you hopefully will like, dear Kerstin, that we of course are very intrigued and inclined to think that oxytocin and that the oxytocin receptor might be the healing agent to everything which occurs to us. And there is this one study which we know and we already discussed together, Kerstin, that Unternäher, they identified or they investigated whether maternal adversities and cortisol levels during pregnancy predict cord blood DNA methylation of the oxytocin receptor. So the cord blood of 39 babies was taken, and maternal saliva examples were also analyzed during the second and third trimester, and oxytocin receptor DNA methylation was found to be significantly negatively associated with stressful life events, Edinburgh postnatal depression scales values, and changes in cortisol profiles at the second trimester. And this decreased oxytocin receptor DNA methylation relates to a rise in expression level, and it might actually counteract a number of the effects of maternal adversities during pregnancy and after childbirth. So this is a familiar thought we have shared before in our collaboration. So how to conclude what I have been discussing and sharing with you? What questions, as with any research, I think we really need to consider what questions do we want to raise. Do we need to ask women more regarding trauma? And I was surprised to see that there is a review of existing checklists on refugee trauma measurement. So there is a lot of material how we can ask women whether they are aware of a trauma or not. Or second option, do we need to guide women safely through a challenging period in a very rigorous way with a penetrating voice like Ethel Margaret Burnside was practicing it. So she was very successful in the way how she practiced. Or should we trust that oxytocin is the most healing agent? This is something we may listen and hear in our next talk from Kerstin. Or, and this is now my final suggestion, will there be a completely new theory we need to think of? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mechthild. And there's lots of things there that tied into things I was saying this morning. So, and I hope that I gave you this morning the keys to understand what Mechthild was saying. And now we've got the microphone, we've got Mechthild. Who's got questions? None? Well, in that case, Mechthild, I don't know whether to congratulate you for explaining everything in such a way that everybody understood it, or whether we've confused them to such a point that they don't know where to start with the questions. And can I ask you a question, Mechthild? Do you think that some of the studies looking at the methylation, where they only had 18, 20 participants, we're not missing things just because we don't have the statistical power to see it?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Good question, Jonathan. So I was, the Rutgers study started with 23 participants or 25 and was then fed into a meta-analysis with studies relating to the same factor, and they were able to really increase the numbers. I think it's very likely that a study with a lower sample size comes up with a non-significant result, which in fact might become significant if the sample size would have been increased. But I was pleased to see that studies in your field of expertise, they are also using meta-analytic techniques to point out and increase the statistical benefits we could clearly see here. Yeah. I think this is possible for studies which are very focused, which really have a very clear and focused aim to investigate, and this will certainly become less likely if the aim of the study is analyzed and investigated in a bigger picture, with
Yeah. Can I ask a question also?
Of course you can, Kerstin.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking of this Latino paradox, because long ago I learned that if you looked at the risk of developing cardiovascular disease in the United States, you could find that in certain areas where you had a lot of Italian immigrants, they had much less risk of developing cardiovascular disease. It was in fact the same as they had in Italy. Whereas in others where they had changed, where they did not live so close together and had the very tight social engagement in the group, they had the same risk of cardiovascular disease, which is actually, say, increased stress levels in a sense, that the Americans had, the other Americans. So I'm sort of wondering if the Latinos, the first generation, if they keep to another more positive social engagement system in the family, which might be protective.
Yeah. Yes. So I think the term Latino is also a little bit misleading. We should talk here just for our understanding, maybe about the first generation paradox. So I think it does not so much matter where they actually moved from, also where they came from, let's say from the Hispanic area of South America or so. It could also be from all other parts in the world, as long as they are protected within their family environment in a very caring manner. I'm happy to say that I have been observing this here. Sometimes as a clinician, you only observe things you get to know about, and when I learned about this first generation paradox, then I started to think about it when it happened in practice. So these mothers are not so complicated like some other mothers who think they cannot give birth spontaneously. They just give it because, they are able to do it. Or they think, well, I'm so happy that I can give birth and this is the most precious thing in my life, whereas I am not so well off in economical and socioeconomic situations, but that they then can enjoy, that they feel that they give birth to a baby in a healthy body, something like that,